Well, hello, grievers. Mandy here. Restorative grief is all about creating easy access to healing, no matter where or who you are. That's why I want you to remember that if you want grief support beyond a podcast, our Patreon features monthly workbooks to accompany each episode, as well as a Discord channel for more private chats and occasional bonus content as well. Supporting this work with your finances means investing in your own wellness and the healing of others, and that in itself is an incredibly generous and restorative practice. The link to the Patreon is in the show notes, but reach out with questions, okay? Now, let's get on to this week's episode. Welcome back to Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. You are listening to episode 160, titled The Grief Police: How Gatekeepers Silence Our Sorrow. Grief support is something I want every human on earth to experience and learn how to offer. But one aspect of this educational work that I stumble across too often is gatekeeping. Before I knew better, I offered the same critical voice toward grievers without realizing the damage I caused. So this week, we're going to explore the harmful aspects of gatekeeping on the grief process and how it affects individuals and communities so that we can continue to learn and serve one another in healing work, and we can do so as advocates, not enforcers. I'm grateful that my own gatekeeping days of grief are far behind me, but that doesn't mean I can stop paying attention. Without intending to, we can easily return to old habits of centering our knowledge or lived experiences when someone shares their sorrow. Gatekeeping in grief work often manifests as controlling who is allowed to express grief and how they should do so, and it's not always easy to recognize despite the profound damage it causes. It also includes defining who or what is worthy of grief, drawing strong boundaries around what a, quote, real loss looks and feels like. Gatekeeping language and behaviors in grief support groups can lead to increased feelings of isolation and invalidation among grievers. When people are told that their way of grieving is wrong or that they don't belong, it exacerbates their pain and hinders their healing process. Instead of sharing, the griever keeps their story locked up, eliminating their opportunity for a witness. In my experience, this is a common issue. People grieving in unconventional ways or outside of societal norms often face judgment and exclusion, which only deepens their sense of loss. Effective grief support must recognize and validate each individual's unique experience rather than imposing rigid expectations. We also know that gatekeeping in a community of grievers causes people to withdraw from seeking support altogether, internalizing feelings of shame and guilt about their need for help. Long term, telling someone their grief is less than makes the entire experience heavier and longer lasting than necessary. And not to mention, it's just plain mean to compare or minimize the grief experience of someone else. To illustrate, consider the case of Maria, a widow who lost her husband unexpectedly. Maria found great solace in sharing her grief openly on social media, where she received an outpouring of support from friends and strangers alike. However, one commenter and supposed friend criticized Maria for not grieving privately, suggesting that her public display of grief was attention seeking. This comment caused Maria to doubt the validity of her own grief experience as well as the positive support received from others, and she felt pressured to withdraw from her online support network. Not to mention, even if it was attention seeking, what's wrong with wanting attention while you're hurting? I think having people turn their eyes, their ears, and their hearts toward us is exactly what we're looking for when we grieve. And so asking for that through a social media might be the only way you have access to people, and that doesn't make it wrong. Maria's story is a perfect example of what it looks like for a grief supporter to center themselves and shape their discomfort into a weapon of self-protection. Gatekeeping in this individual moment allows the person criticizing Maria to feel safer, assuming that Maria will stop interjecting her pain into the commenter's online world. Some people go so far as to take the conversation offline, sending personal emails or text messages with scolding narratives of how they should be grieving. If you've ever received or even sent a comment like this is a good moment to pause and reflect. What were you trying to accomplish? Are you aware of your motives? Did you lean toward the person with curiosity and compassion, or did you pull away from that relationship in self preservation with a critical voice? Gatekeeping doesn't just harm individuals, it damages the community as a whole. Gatekeeping behaviors in grief communities can create a deeper experience of exclusion and mistrust. And when certain members of a community are deemed less legitimate in their grief, it also creates a hierarchical structure that undermines the communal support essential for collective healing. This is also a method of disenfranchising someone's grief when you wonder aloud at the validity of their experience. We see it often in online spaces. The loveless questions from strangers and trolls about crying over spilled milk or whatever they see as not necessary. We also see it specifically in spiritual communities, bypassing with platitudes and scriptures because the framework of one's faith should overcome the pain of loss, no matter what it is. This divisive atmosphere can stifle open dialogue and prevent the sharing of diverse perspectives on grief. Communities thrive on inclusivity and shared experiences, and gatekeeping disrupts this, making it difficult for all members to feel safe and supported. For example, in a grief support group, there may be unwritten rules about how grief should be expressed or what types of losses are considered valid. When individuals deviate from these norms, they may face ostracism or criticism from other group members. This not only silences their voices, but also perpetuates a culture of shame and judgment within the community. If we find ourselves in a situation where shame and judgment are used to control the atmosphere, this is another great moment to reflect. How am I contributing to this atmosphere? How can I combat these negative impacts? What actions can I take to create inclusivity in this space instead of judgment? And how will I encourage others to engage with respect, validating the grief experience of others, especially when I don't understand what they're feeling? One thing I want to mention here is that it is crucial to differentiate between advocacy and gatekeeping. When we confront gatekeeping behavior, often the response includes a self protective statement such as, I was just trying to be helpful, or I don't think they need to be so upset about this, so I'm trying to make that clear for them so they feel better. Advocacy involves supporting and uplifting others, ensuring their voices are heard and respected. On the other hand, harmful gatekeeping involves policing how others express their grief and determining who is even allowed to participate in grief conversations and communities. So, for example, as an advocate, my goal is to create space where grievers can express themselves freely and find support. This means challenging harmful platitudes and misinformation that can invalidate someone's grief. However, it also means being mindful not to impose my views on how others should grieve. Advocacy should always aim to include and support, not exclude and control. If I'm trying to be helpful, my role as an advocate leads me to ask questions of the griever that are open and curious, not critical or leading. A peer-reviewed article in the Journal of Counseling and Development discusses the fine line between advocacy and gatekeeping, emphasizing that true advocacy respects the autonomy of grievers and offers support without dictating the terms. This approach fosters a healthier, more inclusive environment where all grievers can find solace and understanding. Advocacy promotes resilience and well-being among grievers, providing education on diverse grief experiences and challenging stigma and common myths can help reduce the negative impacts of gatekeeping and promote healing within communities. Our role is not to tell people how or what to grieve. It is to stand alongside them while they grieve and offer support when it is requested. It is also true that grief professionals are not immune to gatekeeping in their work. I often witness mental health professionals intentionally or otherwise gatekeeping grief by creating a hierarchy about which losses are more important or meaningful than others. This can have detrimental effects on grievers who look up to those professionals who feel that their own grief is minimized or invalidated. For example, a therapist may focus on the grief of a parent who has lost a child more than the child who's lost a pet, considering it more profound or deserving of attention. This hierarchical approach leaves grievers feeling unheard or dismissed, contributing to their already growing feelings of isolation and potential inadequacy in their grieving work. A book I read once by a popular grief author categorized their own loss as the pinnacle of grief, going on to list a handful of other griefs and losses that, quote, paled in comparison. But my question is, why are we comparing grief in the first place? In many cases, it's these grief professionals unintentionally reinforcing the societal norms about what constitutes a legitimate loss, perpetuating the culture of gatekeeping even within therapeutic settings. This can alienate individuals whose grief does not fit these predefined categories, leading them to question the validity of their own emotions and experiences. But it is entirely possible to validate the grief experience of one person without minimizing the pain of someone else. To address this issue, it is essential for grief professionals to adopt an inclusive and non-judgmental approach to grief counseling. This involves recognizing that every loss is valid and deserving of empathy, regardless of its perceived significance in societal terms. By validating all forms of grief and supporting grievers in their unique experiences, professionals will create a safe, supportive environment where healing can actually occur. And we do this through decentering our lived experiences and our educational background from the conversation. Pathologizing grief has led too many mental health professionals down a path of distress for grievers, and it is up to us to course correct before we create even more harm. It is time for the grief police to retire. Gatekeeping what deserves our attention isolates grievers, fosters mistrust, and undermines the supportive nature and intention of grief communities. So as we move forward, we must continue to distinguish between advocacy and harmful gatekeeping, developing inclusive, validating spaces that respect and support everyone's unique grief journey. As leaders and advocates in the grief community, it is our responsibility to ensure that we are promoting inclusivity and support rather than exclusion and control. This is how we can help create a more compassionate and understanding environment for all who grieve. This is how we can collectively begin to heal. Thank you for listening to episode 160 of Restorative Grief. If you were listening closely, there was a single common thread in this episode between all the different impacts and ways we experience gatekeeping: the word should. When we hear that language of instruction or direction around what we should be doing or feeling, we can use it as a flag waving for our attention to pause and reconsider the messaging. It may not be as helpful as it sounds, or it may simply be the perfect moment for us to push back and redefine how we want to be treated in our grief. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, I hope you feel a new sense of responsibility and energy rising for your advocacy and grief work. Continue to move gently toward your own story and the story of others, and trust that an open heart will lead you away from gatekeeping and other harmful behaviors. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow me on social media so you can stay on top of every weekly episode and all the new resources. Consider becoming a patron of the show if you want to go deeper in your own work. And of course, feel free to reach out to me about coaching opportunities and other resources as well. And as always, before we go, one last thing. Please remember, the only solution for grief is to do the work of grieving. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week.